Welcome to the UnionDues podcast. The UK's only all things union show, produced for your downloadable digital delight and appreciation.
You better listen, my brother, 'cause if you do, you can hear there are voices still calling from across the years, and they're crying across the
Dear
ocean.
friends, welcome to the Labor
They're
Radio
crying
Podcast Network
across
profile
the
series
heavens.
highlighting the work of our members. The growing network of over 70 shows in 4 countries serves as a one-stop shop for audiences looking for labor content and as a resource for labor broadcasters, podcasters, and content producers. My name is Evan Papp, and I produce Empathy Media Lab's podcast on labor, political economy, arts, and culture. And we're a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. Today, I'm speaking with Simon Sapper of UnionDues. Hello, Simon. Could you tell me a little bit
Hi,
about
Evan.
yourself? Hello, and where you grew up, and what led you to organize labor?
Well, Evan, I've been in organised labour all my working life, really, or even before then, because I first got into organised labour because my dad and my uncle were both union reps. So my dad and my uncle we'd go round to my uncle's house, my uncle would come round to our house, and they'd talk union stuff all the time. And then I'd go down to the shops with my dad, and he'd bump into someone else he knew from the union movement. So it just seemed like the most normal thing in the world. And in those days, which was like the 1970s in the UK, that was when labour was at its height. 13.2 million members of a trade union at that time. So the union leaders were in the news a lot, and they were like giants. They were my heroes, really. And of course, like lots of kids, you grow up wanting to be like your dad. So I kind of followed his footsteps into organised labour. And this was, I'm a Londoner. I've lived most of my life in London. So it was a very buzzy, vibrant atmosphere. Lots going on, and it just seemed like the natural thing to do. It was only as I grew older that I realised I was a bit of a geek. I was the odd one out, and actually unions were a more specialist interest. But nevertheless, unions have been my home in more ways than one.
So a lot of people aren't familiar with unions at all. Could you talk a little bit about why you may be interested, or why people should be interested in labor news, and why you think unions and organized labor are important and should be covered?
Well, it's important to realise that even though membership is not as great as it once was, in the UK, for example, there are still 6 million people who are members of unions. That's the biggest voluntary network in the country by a long way. And I think people understand that there are some things you can do for yourself, but some things you get far more by working together. A collective voice at work, a collective voice in the community. You can get far more by being part of a collective. You get far more protection by being part of a collective than you ever could as an individual. And once that message sinks home, actually the recruitment discussion becomes a lot easier with people when you say to people, I think you should join the union because.
It's really interesting, the parallels between the Thatcher government and the Reagan government. And I feel like we've been living in the United States in the Reagan arena my entire life for the last 40 years. And I'm just interested about what are some of the things that you saw, I guess, when Thatcher came to power and the attack on labor unions in general.
It was a real I was going to say a wake-up call, but it wasn't a wake-up call. It was an alarm bell ringing very, very loudly. The 1970s in the UK saw the most progress towards equality, the narrowing between the richest and the poorest that there'd ever been in the UK. So we get to the end of the 70s, and suddenly, bang, we get a Reaganite person like Margaret Thatcher becoming Prime Minister. And she very quickly made her mark, and not in a good way. She gave a speech at which she said, there's no such thing as society, only family. So, of course, for community-based organisations that believe in collectivism, that's a problem to start with. And then systematically, she set about privatising state-owned industries and doing it in such a way that broke union power. So, but each year as we went through the 1980s, there were disputes in the steel industry, in the print industry, in the health service, and most famously probably in the mines as well. And each time there was a real aggression and a very clear political agenda towards deregulation and deunionization. So that's what I saw. Of course, I was born in 1962, so I know I don't look it, but but therefore I went from school to college in 1980, and I was in the college union movement, and the college labour movement, and then came out into the workforce when I graduated in 1984. So by that time, as well as all the disputes that we've spoken about, trade unions had been banned at the government communications headquarters, sort of our equivalent of the Pentagon in the US, because they thought that the government said trade unionism is incompatible with national security. I mean, what an insult to people who have been loyal servants, protecting their country and being union members, to be suddenly told, you've got to choose one or the other. So therefore the fight to save the union movement, as it were, was still very live and very loud. And that's why I started applying for jobs with trade unions. And eventually, after endless applications, someone took me on.
Why national security? Because I'm almost thinking back of like the McCarthy years in the United States as a parallel, was that a lot of the organized labor was red baited as being communist and Soviet. And so that was one way that labor was attacked in the 1950s. But in the UK, why did they cite national security concerns?
I don't know. I really don't know. And and I'm sure there must be a treatise on it somewhere or other. But if you think about the people who were working as, as technicians essentially, or scientists for the government communications headquarters, if you're going to target them, why not target people who are the civilian staffs in nuclear power stations or for nuclear submarines or a whole host of other reasons? And there seemed to be no other argument other than we think this is a weak spot, or we think this is a particular spot, and we're going to push. But it turned out that 11 or so of the trade unionists at GCHQ refused to give up their union membership and were ultimately dismissed because of that. And then when the Labour Party came back into power in 1997, one of the first things they did was to revoke the ban on trade union membership at GCHQ.
So could you talk a little bit about your show, UnionDues, and why you wanted to start it and what it's about?
Well, UnionDues is the UK's only all things general union show. And it exists because there's a need for it. There's an audience for it. Before UnionDues, there was a thing called the Unions 21 podcast, which occupied similar sort of territory. And I was privileged enough to produce and co-host that. But then when Unions 21, which is like a very well-respected and active sort of campaign-orientated think tank, when they decided, actually, we'll take a break from podcasts, there's suddenly this audience, but no one to service it. So I thought, okay, let's have a go at producing my own show. And, as every podcaster listening to this will know, as I'm sure you know yourself, Evan, when you actually have the idea for your show and you develop it and you build it up and you bring it to market, as it were, it's really exciting. Yeah, it's very, you kind of think a bit scary, but it's kind of exciting as well. And what we tend to do each episode is I'll have a featured guest, someone of note or someone who's made a unique contribution or is in the news about what they're doing in the trade union labour movement in the UK. And I'll have a general roundup of news and views. Always a shout out to the Labour Radio Podcast Network, of course, because very proud to be associated with that. And we tend to go in blocks of 8 or 9, and then we have a break, and then we have another block of 8 or 9. But we have special episodes as well. I mean, for example, I'm really chuffed that I've got a show coming up with the General Secretary of the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions following the fantastic win by New Zealand Labour and Jacinda Ardern recently. That'll be an opportunity to discuss with our New Zealand listeners and anyone else who's interested what that victory means for the labour movement down under.
One of your recent shows called A Brave New World of Work, you focus on data and almost like algorithmic management as the future of some of how workers are going to be managed, quote unquote. It was incredible. Do you want to talk a little bit about just what was in that show?
Well, The Brave New World of Work is a deliberate play on words because it reads across to some of the ideas in Aldous Huxley's book from the 1930s about what the Brave New World will look like. And my guest was Dr. Christina Colclough, who some of the listeners to this podcast may have come across before, because she is a global expert on labour in a digital environment. And what she essentially was saying is, either by default or design, unions are so busy firefighting, so busy servicing existing members, protecting their terms and conditions, that they haven't really got to grips with what data is and what the power of algorithms are. Even though many workers today are governed by algorithm, they never see a line manager or a supervisor. They just get it on their phones or their tablets, what they're supposed to do. And it's a key challenge for unions to be able to, first of all, understand what data is, and secondly, exert some control of it, just as we would over any other piece of new technology. Because unless we do that, we retreat from this space. And if we retreat from this space, then people who may well be hostile to us, frankly, can occupy it. And say our data is mined and bundled up and then shipped, say, from the UK to the US, and shipped from the US to Japan, and shipped back to the US, and then uploaded into the cloud. We have no control over it. We have no access to it. But it may be building a picture, a program of the perfect worker. Excuse me. Sorry. It may be building an algorithm of what the perfect worker is. But the characteristics in that algorithm, I bet you, won't include someone who's in favour of collective voice, someone who's active in their trade union. And they, of course, it may not stop at that. It might not include someone who is a registered Democrat, or it might not include someone who has no hair or whatever. So what Christina was talking about is you need to understand, you need to have input, and you need to build in diversity and inclusivity, because even if you or I were to build in that algorithm, we've got our kind of biases, just like any other individual. And what says that what looks good to us is necessarily good for everyone? So it really was, I mean, I'm glad you picked that one up, because I think that was one that really mapped out in a very clear way something that actually is over the horizon for many unions, but it needs to be brought closer, that's for sure.
Absolutely. So as a member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network, could you talk about why you think this network is important?
Oh, it's a great idea, and so necessary, because I think a lot of us feel sometimes isolated. Sometimes we can feel a bit, intimidated, maybe. But it's important to build unity and build strength. I mean, a basic watchword for our movement is unity is strength, and that's as important in podcasting as it is in any other form. And what the value of it? I mean, there's value in exchanging information. There's value in being part of a collective. There's value in being able to say, if you like what I'm doing, have a look in this portal, which is what I do every show. But I was also struck by something that I saw recently on the network. Judy Ansell down in Kansas City, who runs a great podcast down there, put a note out about how in her part of the US, voters are being intimidated. Basically, there's not only a drive to keep people away from the polls, voters are being intimidated. And she was saying, has anyone else got this sort of experience? What else, any ideas about how it can be countered and stuff like that? And I just sent her a brief private note to say, solidarity. I'm not sure I can help in terms of podcast material, but solidarity, because that sounds a really bad state of affairs. And it's just that ability to be able to give, solidarity and support to each other on a personal as well as a kind of podcast level that I think's really important, really important.
Absolutely agree. And this network is, I think, going to play a very important role going into 2021 and beyond. And I feel blessed meeting people like you. And it's also just opening my mind to all of these different struggles. And it's bridging these struggles in a lot of ways.
Yes.
As I hear about people fighting and oftentimes losing, but every victory is a victory for all workers everywhere. And so I feel very fortunate to meet people like you as well.
No, that's great. It's an encouragement, isn't it? It's not just a kind of defensive thing of we're part of a collective, we're not alone, but actually it broadens the mind. Absolutely, yeah. It's a great thing, and thank you for the work you do in terms of maintaining and nourishing the network.
Thank you. So, in closing, looking into the future of organized labor, where do you see opportunity and hope?
I see opportunity and hope in two particular ways rather than places. The first is that especially as we continue to get to grips with coronavirus, I've heard more and more people describing it like a war. A war because actually everything's up in the air, nothing's certain, who knows what the world will look like after it. But in the midst of the last global conflict, there were some tremendously positive things in terms of a social movement, especially in the UK. There was a thing called the Beveridge Report that was written by a centrist politician in 1943 or 1944 that set out the foundations of what then became the welfare state that has become a consensus. There's been a consensus in favour of the core elements of it, such as our National Health Service, that exists to this day. Maybe this set of circumstances will throw up a second Beveridge Report. It would be great to think that there was a coming together, a consensus behind a view that said we can't go back to the way we were. I mean, I don't know whether that will happen or not. One can but hope. The second place I see hope is that even in the midst, or possibly particularly because of the uncertainty of coronavirus, the appetite for unionism, the appetite for collective voice and collective action is really strong. We're seeing a number of new unions form and bubble up in the UK from people who have been hard to recruit for the conventional unions. So people who are hospital porters or ancillary staff, people who work in the gaming industry, creatives. All these people are getting together and forming unions and taking action to defend their terms and conditions or to try and get themselves a better deal. So that shows that the idea of unionism is alive and the spirit of it is quite strong. I think there's great opportunity. There's also great risk. Of course there is, but isn't there always? But the glass is certainly half full rather than half empty.
You better listen, my brother, 'cause if you do, you can hear there are voices still calling from across the years. And they're crying across the ocean, they're crying across the land, and they will until we all come to understand. None of us are free, none of us are free, none of us are free, if one of us is chained, none of us are free, 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 if one of us is chained, none of us are free. There are people in darkness, they just can't see the light. If we don't say it's wrong, then that says it's right. We got to feel for each other, let our brothers know we're here. Got to get the message, send it out all loud and clear. None of us are free,